Hello and welcome to Conversations from the A&amp Network. In this episode, I speak to Dr Elaine Machett, a solo adoptive parent. Drawing on her own personal experience, she shares the results of her interviews with adoptive parents in relation to the challenges they faced when their children first moved in. As well as being a huge transition and stress for children, for many parents it's a difficult time where they can feel overwhelmed and struggle to adjust. Elaine shares the themes and issues the parents raised, and we discussed our own experiences. As always, if you've experienced of adoption, fostering or special guardianship from any perspective, personal or professional, and would like to share that on the podcast, please get in touch through the Facebook page, the app formerly known as Twitter, or you can email us at aandfpodcast@gmail.com.
I'm Elaine Machett. I'm a lecturer at Coventry University. I've sort of been working in higher education for 14 years, and before that I was a teacher, primary and secondary schools. But I adopted my son in 2013, so he's 14, just turned 14. And I'm a solo adopter, which is sort of part of why I'm here, I think, and part of the research that I've done. So I think whilst I think, lots to say about what that adoption journey looked like and my life as a solo adopter, he's a really brilliant boy. He's a really funny boy, and we're very, very compatible. So I probably, everything I say is kind of against that backdrop, really, where I do feel that we've got a very strong relationship, but, nonetheless, there's some definite ups and downs along the way.
I mean, yeah, you didn't necessarily come on to talk about your own experience, but I would be duty bound to kind of dig around a little bit. So if you're happy for me to, if you can tolerate a level of that, and can I ask you? I mean, being a solo adopter is relatively, it's not that unusual, but 10 years ago probably less usual. What sort of brought you to adoption, if I can ask?
So I'd always been interested in adoption right from a really young age, sort of awareness perhaps of things that had happened in other families I knew, but I'd always considered it a definite option. It wasn't, for me, it wasn't a sort of, something I came to through
sort of a plan B.
Not been able to consider. Yeah. So it was always something I'd thought about. And I sort of had gone along to information in evenings from, a relatively young age, and had sort of looked around me and realised I was at that point quite a bit younger than most people, and perhaps I could just kind of live with the idea for a little while and give myself a bit of time. So it wasn't a sort of a big shock in that way to me to actually sort of go down the adoption route. So then I did sort of start that process somewhere in my 30s. And but I think maybe in a way, because I'd always lived with that idea of, that I would be interested in adoption, that maybe in some ways that maybe actually blinded me to some of the realities of adoption, because I think I thought I'd lived with it for a long time as an idea, and therefore somehow I was more prepared, which absolutely didn't turn out to be the case.
Well, and that's interesting you say that, because I sort of had this image of you sort of being like a serial kind of information evening attendee, which is not what you said, but it's hard, isn't it? Because actually the cultural reference points for adoption in terms of children's literature, adult literature, cinema, faith, there's so many versions of adoption that actually sifting through that to actually get some sort of reality is quite tricky, isn't it?
Really tricky. And I think that is one of the hardest things I think I have experienced over the years of being an adopted parent for my son and myself. The kind of social narratives around adoption, things you just hear incidentally, which are hard enough as an adopted parent to hear, I think. And I really do worry, probably selfishly just about my own son most of the time, what it's like to hear that, just casually listening to the radio, and there'll be a story about an adoptive child and phrases like, of course, they were very grateful to their adopted parents and things like that. And I just think, it must be a very confusing message. And yeah, I find that really difficult as an adult. So it is, yeah, it's a tough old world to navigate, I think.
Yeah, and yeah, as you say, it's so pervasive that a lot of people are blind to it, aren't they? You know, as you say, like the school, it's again no criticism, but just actually no one's joined the dots of how this may
No,
land
no
for a
one had
young
joined the
person.
dots. Yeah.
Um, so I'm gonna keep going with my questions because I'm a naturally curious instinct. So as a solo adopter, I'm sort of curious about the response of the people around you, really. You know, even like I was thinking, you know, you said you're a teacher. What's the staff room conversation about? All right, so you know, Elaine is gonna adopt a child. What?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question because the response, I still remember those conversations word by word all these years later. And there were some of the strangest conversations. And I remember the people who just, I one one woman that I worked with wrote me a card and just sort of said, "This is joyous news." And I was, it was just lovely. And I, remember her very, very warmly because of that. But equally, there were just some really odd conversations. Some people were slightly annoyed that I hadn't told them that that was my plan and felt that I'd sort of, I don't know, somehow sort of let them down by not telling them that I was, sort of going through that process of being approved, which again, I found quite slightly odd because I don't expect to be told that somebody's trying for a baby. You know, I don't expect any of my friends to let me into that
Yeah.
intimate detail of their lives. And the thing that was said to me the most, which I found I just didn't know what I was supposed to say, is that I was told I was brave many, many times. And I would just sort of
Hmm.
stand there and I just don't know what to say to that. And I wonder if you would say that to me if I had a partner. Is that because you're saying that about adoption, or are you saying that because I'm on my own? I don't know. But yeah, I found that a very curious response really to the situation. Um, I'm sure they meant well, but it was I felt it was a very odd thing to say to me.
Well, it's sort of like you say, it raises more questions than it answers, doesn't it? It's a question that, or it's a statement that sort of you sort of want to go, well, what are your perceptions of solo parenting? What are your perceptions of
Yeah.
children who need adopting, and what your perception of me?
Yes, absolutely. And I think the thing I always found really, I realized throughout the whole thing that I was quite naive about quite a few things because, we were all people who worked in education. We were all people who would, advocate for the rights of children. That was very much what we did day in,
Yeah.
day out. And then it just seemed then all the more surprising, to have that reaction from people who I just didn't expect them to say that to me. So yeah, it certainly didn't make you want to talk to them about it anyway.
And so, what's the process? You know, that aside, I feel like we could do a podcast on it. I feel like the stories you've got to do you haven't shared with me. Um, but in terms of then going through the process on your own and getting through approval, was that was that was that smooth? Was that rough? Was that sort of just normal?
Yeah, so one of the things I suppose I'd really like to say is that there were a couple of things that happened which were just brilliant. So, firstly, in our preparation group, I was not the only solo adopter, which I'm sure is very difficult to make that happen, but I don't know how much that was just luck of the draw or how planned that was, but it was incredibly helpful to both of us because I was lucky enough to do preparation groups in person.
Hmm.
And it meant, of course, that when you do those paired tasks, that we could just go together and we didn't feel like we stuck out like sore thumbs. So that was a really lovely thing, and we could empathize with each other. We adopted within 2 or 3 days of each other, and um, so we could ring each other and kind of empathize with, just this enormous change to our lives. So that was brilliant. And the other thing that was brilliant was that one of the social workers at the preparation group, who I think was also a single parent, said to us, please do not feel in any way that you are any further down our kind of list, if you like, because you're on your own. We have found many, many times that our children do very well with single adopters. And I think, that's a message that I hope all single adopters get during that process, because it really did. I mean, obviously, I do remember it to this day, and it was lovely to hear that at the beginning of the process, that we didn't need to, that they had our back, all of those sorts of things. It was really reassuring. And I think one of the things that I would say is that, I do know a few other single adopters as well, and I think there are some really great things that do come along with being a single adopter. And I often do think back to what was said, about adopted children doing well with single adopters. And I do think that along with all the many struggles that do come with being on your own and a lot of the logistical kind of difficulties, there is a sort of decisiveness, I think, that comes with doing it on your own. You have to make a plan. You don't need to necessarily talk it over with somebody. You can make that decision for your child, and you can action it, kind of thing, quite quickly. And I think certainly for myself, my son, I do think that's worked for us. I think it's been a really clear message for him about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and then we've stuck to it, whatever the plan that would be. And I often do sort of reflect on what would that look like if I was with a partner, because he's needed some extra support educationally. We've done various programs which have required like daily exercises, and they are really quite dull and quite hard to stick to, in truth. And I do reflect on that, and I sort of think some days, of course, I think, oh, if I had a partner, this would be a million times easier. It wouldn't have to be me every day. But then, of course, it could work the other way, and they may not be as on board with it. They may not think it's worthwhile, potentially, and in which case, obviously, you lose that decisiveness that I hope has benefited him. So I think I really heard that message from the social worker that children can do well with single adopters, and I do see some of those things play out, and that is something I would like to kind of, just in case any of the single adopters weren't kind of told that, I think that's a really positive message that we were given.
It is encouraging, and like you say, I think that oftentimes, I mean, I work in fostering, so we approve all kinds of families, all kinds of people, single, couples, all kinds of family makeups, and the truth is that for every Jack there's a Jill, for every child there's a home, and sometimes it's about finding. It doesn't have to look like it should look in the the books from the 50s. It's just got to work, and a solo parent can bring something to a child who maybe needs a quiet sort of certainty in life that a house full of other kids, they're just not going to get that. I kind of move you on a little bit in terms of your story, which sort of links into the research that you're doing, because you are an academic, you are a doctor, which I think it's important we acknowledge. We always acknowledge doctors on the podcast because we're all deeply in awe of you. So you were approved, obviously, and then you were matched, I presume, and then sort of you had a child move in, and so do you feel comfortable sharing your own experience and then sort of maybe linking that to the research?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. So I think that one of the things that I hadn't really thought through about being on my own was that potentially when you're going through the process, that you compartmentalize it maybe more than if you were with a partner, because I think I found what I would do is I would have my meetings with my social worker, and then essentially I'd go back to work, and I would think about it, of course, and I might talk to a friend about it. But what I couldn't do was spend an evening unpicking that interview with somebody else. And I think in some ways, what that meant was, in some ways, I don't think I found the whole process as stressful as I might have done, because it was just running alongside everything else, really. But I do think that for me, at least, and this is This is only my own experience. I have no evidence at all that this is the case for other solo adopters. But for me, I think what it meant was when I actually brought my son home, I was pretty emotionally unprepared in reality.
Right.
And I do wonder, I'm sure it's just an enormous shock for the vast majority of people, suddenly having a child, really. But I do wonder what impact that has over the course of that preparation of just not really having a reliable person to talk that over with, and probably pros and cons in reality, I'm sure. But, for me, the reality on my own was that I was just completely overwhelmed, really, that the enormity of being responsible for this little boy who, and I think one of the terrible kind of ironies really is obviously at the beginning they need you so much, and obviously they've had this enormous upheaval in their lives, and you're also experiencing your own huge adjustment. So my son was essentially non-verbal, and which again on my own I had underestimated. I knew that obviously before I adopted him, but I'd underestimated what that would mean for me on my own, sort of, during that period, the cocooning period, especially where you aren't really, you're not seeing other people. On my own, with this lovely, smiley, lovely boy who couldn't really talk or speak to me or communicate. He was incredibly energetic. Very, very clingy. And I know these things are not unusual, but so you go from living on your own, just you in the house, to obviously, not being able to go to the toilet without an audience, all those sorts of things. And
well, I think it's easy to look back and laugh now, but at the time you think that is like everything you've ever been told about children, like as a teacher in education, and that is just not a thing to do. But then you've got a child who's, like you say, he's tiny. What was he, sort of two-ish, around that age?
Yeah.
So you can't just like go, oh well, you keep yourself busy. I'm off to the loo for 2 minutes.
No.
And that is a real thing, isn't it?
Oh, it's a real thing. Like you say, obviously you do laugh about it now, years later. And I would laugh about it at the time to some extent, but there were definitely days where I just want to go to the toilet on my own. So from definitely, I think from living, a life that you were completely in control of as a single person, to a child that was very clingy, but also, and still is, incredibly energetic. So fortunately for me, great sleeper, but once he was awake, and it was the summer, and he would wake up as soon as it was light. So, sort of 4:30-ish, wide awake. And I lived in a terrace house, so I was really conscious of the amount of noise, because once he was awake, that was that, the amount of noise that might make. So I'd be taking him to a local park at sort of 5:15 in the morning. And and so I really was exhausted, and I just didn't know what else to do at that stage. So I think managing that on your own and managing the emotional impact and trying to support, obviously, your child through that, really, what must have been, I realised more and more as I know him, what must have been just such an incredible upheaval for him. I think obviously that takes its toll after a while.
You reminded me, I remember during our introductions, I remember it being sort of just 7 o'clock in the morning, and we've been at the park for far too long, and me thinking, I literally have run out of things to do today. I don't know what we're going to do. And like you said, I look back now and think, wow, but at the time it was just, there was nothing else. I was just thinking, what are we going to do? How are we going to live for the next 18 years like this?
Yeah. Thank goodness for parks, because
and the summer,
yes. So definitely just not with six, really. I think the reality of it. And obviously doing that on your own. And then I think one of the things that I do look back on, and I don't laugh about so much, is that really during that time, the only person who asked me if I was okay was a visiting health worker who I hadn't been expecting. I didn't know I was getting a visit from a health worker. They just knocked on my door one day, and they sort of realised I hadn't been informed, and they hadn't been informed that I'd adopted. They just had my address and contact details. And she was absolutely lovely. She was considering adoption herself. She was a really lovely woman. But I wasn't expecting her. And she had a trainee with her, and she sort of said, look, I'm just really sorry. If I'd known this was the situation, I would have come on my own. And she was the one who sort of said to me, and how are you? Are you okay? And I, at the time, I didn't really know what to do with that question, because I hadn't met her before. And as lovely as she was, I didn't feel that, there was a trainee with her, and my son was kind of milling around. And I didn't feel that I was going to sort of say, well, actually, I am completely overwhelmed and I'm not quite sure what I'm doing here. And also, I never saw her again. So although she was absolutely lovely, it was just the wrong person, really. And and really over the years, I suppose, the more distance there is between me and that event, the more I look back on that more objectively and sort of think it's really shocking that she was the only person who asked how I was. It wasn't hard to predict for anybody, that they would find those early weeks of being an adoptive parent difficult. It really isn't hard to anticipate that somebody on their own would be finding it difficult. The further away it gets from that point, the more kind of objectively shocked I am by that. And that does then lead into sort of what I'm hoping to research and look at, and have been interviewing parents about. So and obviously it is 11 years ago, and obviously the conversation around mental health and well-being just generally in society has moved on a long way since then. So I was really curious to just know what's changed, and do parents now have a more open conversation? Is that part of the preparation, much more explicitly, about how you may feel and how you need to have a plan for managing your own emotion, your own well-being during that time? And so I interviewed 11 parents sort of from March this year, and it was a really I don't really know what the right word is.
Can I ask you, I was going to say, but I'm sorry to cut across you, but I was thinking, so is this in terms of, obviously you've got a PhD, which is in relating to children in care, which people can look up. But in terms of you interviewing, is that in view of you sort of kind of, again, producing academic research to kind of inform practice and where are you pitching it? What are you doing with that?
So partly, I do hope to write some academic articles, but not solely that is my hope. I am just about to send this off to Adoption UK. So I've written it up as an article for Adoption UK magazine. They were brilliantly helpful and put a call out in their magazine for participants as well. And then what I really hope, what I'm really interested in is kind of informal local support for adopters. What I feel has been lost through the in-person preparation groups. Just somebody who isn't assessing you, somebody who isn't making notes, not there for the big stuff, in truth, is my vision of that, because I think adoptive parents have probably got their own plates are probably quite full. There's probably a limit to the support that can be offered, but also, of course, more complex things I'm sure are best left to the professionals. But I think what I've discovered all the way through.
And I've been regretting interrupting you before, because you were about to say you sort of articulated that the experience of actually being really humbled by the interviews and what people have sort of shared with you.
Yeah. So just the amount of love obviously everybody has for their children is always, just a lovely thing to hear, and the commitment and the dedication to that, despite some really challenging experiences and situations, but the commitment to really understanding their children's, the emotions behind the behaviours, is a pretty impressive thing when you were kind of listening to what they'd experienced in some cases, so some accounts of obviously, child to parent violence, and so really, it was really amazing to listen to their accounts of their adoption. So I really asked them to talk about what that early stage was like. So those first few weeks and months while the child's come home to you, but you're waiting for the adoption order, and what that was like for them. And what I was really trying to listen to was what their own well-being had been like during that time, and if they had been supported, if they had that as part of their preparation process, what support had been offered to them. Did they feel they could talk openly about the sense of overwhelm or isolation? Those were the sort of words that were coming up a lot. And really then, recommendations from them, what could be done differently, could be done more effectively to support people. And, really what I found was that with one or two exceptions, it didn't feel like a huge amount of change, really.
Right.
In the 11 years, it's a very small group, it's a very small sample of parents, but a lot of people still spoke very clearly and passionately about how hard it had been, how overwhelmed they'd felt, the kind of, post-adoption depression, which, are kind of, I don't think we're familiar with that term when I adopted. So the conversation has moved on a little bit, maybe, but.
Well, yeah, but I was sort of thinking, well, you were 10, you're talking to people who are sort of probably have adopted more recently, and then you're 10 years ago, and then our first adoption was 25 years ago.
Wow.
But I'm not hearing much difference between my experience and your experience, and then the subsequent experience. And I was kind of picked up on this. You mentioned that there's only one person who asked you, but you didn't tell them. And I was wondering whether that was people had similar experiences, that people, for whatever reasons, the conversation had been opened up, but they just didn't feel they could,
yes,
for whatever reason, go through.
100%. Yeah. So quite a lot of people said, my social work was lovely. They were really kind. They were empathetic. They were warm. And they did ask me, not everybody, but some, they did ask me how I was. And time and time again, with no exceptions, they sort of said, well, and I said I was tired. I said it was hard, but I absolutely did not tell the whole story of how hard I was finding it. Because, of course, and what interests me is that until that point that you've got the adoption order, you feel very vulnerable.
Yeah.
So what I was interested in really was, the onus shouldn't be on adoptive parents to get around that. That's a really understandable, rational thing to be concerned about, at that time. And you are obviously your emotions are obviously heightened during that time. And you do have that hanging over you, that it's not quite the end of the road, actually. You still have this adoption order to get through. So one person had a different approach to it, and I just thought it was fantastic. So it was one of the parents I interviewed. She'd had issues with her mental health throughout her adulthood. So what she did was really take the bull by the horns, and she spoke very openly about it through all the meetings with the social worker. And she'd completely anticipated that this huge event in her life may well be a trigger. So she had a plan in place. She knew what the warning signs would be, and she knew what her coping strategies would look like. So that plan was all in place before the adoption. And what she said when she explained this was that in some ways she felt it could be harder for people who perhaps had not had that experience of mental health before adopting, because you may not know to anticipate it. And I think that I really related to what she was saying, because I felt like that was exactly me. I just hadn't, without any prompting, I just hadn't given the thought it deserved. And she sort of said, it should be the anticipation that every single adoptive parent will need this plan, and that every single adoptive parent will need support. And this plan should be standard practice. I've got it. And she had a counsellor arranged, and she had a plan. She knew how to look after herself. She had self-care things planned in. And just really that's the least that adoptive parents should expect as part of that process.
Yeah, I mean, I was ruminating on this very issue, just not even realizing that we were going to be talking about it. But I was thinking about this idea that it's sort of this perfect storm, in that people spend a long time proving that they're capable, and we've got lots of conversations, lots of referees. We've got a collection of this orchestra of people who are saying, Elaine is capable, and you've reached this high threshold. You've gone to panel and you've said, I can do this. And that sort of creates this dynamic where if you get the slightest wobble, it's really hard to go back on that. Because you said, I think that was one of my reflections, was I had to do a lot of convincing. I was quite young when I adopted. And there's a lot of big questions about, well, you're quite young, aren't you? I was going, yeah, but I'm fine. And then all of a sudden I didn't feel fine. I thought, but maybe that's pride. I don't know. Maybe it was pride for me, but that creates a really peculiar dynamic, doesn't
Definitely.
it, for a lot of people?
Definitely. I think there is that element. I certainly felt like, the social worker and myself, she was a lovely woman, but I felt like we both understood what a good mum would look like. And like you say, I've spent all this time convincing you that I can do that picture that I'm sure we both more or less share. And I don't feel like that at the moment. But I'm going to pretend that I'm going to present as matching that description of that good mom. And that was, I mean, obviously it helped nobody. And I think also there's so much, all the conversations that are quite rightly, and of course, are about how is the child and how is the child coping. But, without us being in a good position, clearly that child is, they need us to be well and coping for them to do that. So I think that conversation just really needs a rethink about just how it can be built into the system to be more open. And I do think the way to do that is to have that conversation as part of the preparation. So being capable and being a good parent, it's not one thing, and it's going to have ups and it's going to have downs, and reassuring people that just because you have some feelings that aren't comfortable, or you are exhausted, or you might feel a bit resentful, you might have a lot of different emotions knocking around. That doesn't mean this is wrong. This doesn't mean it's not going to work. It doesn't mean you're not a good parent.
Sort of normalizing that this is part of the journey, this sense of, and I'm sure there's some people who don't feel it. There'll be the earth mothers that'll just kind of like hit the floor running, I'm sure. Earth dads, I'm not sure what the earth dad equivalent is, but it seems like it's almost I don't want to say inevitable, but it is really common. Do you think that, I was thinking, you mentioned cocooning, and which feels like a really good way of making this worse.
Yes.
So is there any evidence to sort of suggest that cocooning works? Because I'm quite skeptical about cocooning.
My goodness. I think the two people I spoke to one person I spoke to spoke really favourably about the whole idea of cocooning. And one person had a sort of fine experience, if you like. But the other 9, and I know it's a really small group of people, but the other 9, felt that it had been very, very difficult, really quite harmful. And then some people, I think of one of the parents that I spoke to in particular, it just sounded like it had done tremendous damage, really tremendous damage to her own well-being, to her trust in herself as a parent, because of course what it implies is, and what quite a few people said was, I didn't want to have a party. Basically, I'm not stupid. I wasn't going to do anything crazy. Please have a bit of trust in us. I just needed a friend at that time.
Yeah.
And I was forced to live this quite artificial life. And as a result of that, I've lost a couple of friends. They felt, in a couple of cases, sort of, that they'd been shut out, that perhaps bond with other family members hadn't developed quite as well as they might have done. But certainly in the main, people have just found it very difficult and really quite lonely, and struggled with it as well. I think on a sort of more rational level that, you're telling me I can't have my best friend round, but I can have visitors from social workers, which is quite triggering. And I can have visitors from independent reviewers. And I think for a lot of us, we had a different independent reviewer every time. And those, and quite often in my small sample of experience,
You keep saying that, but
they hadn't been good. They hadn't been positive, those visits. And I think that really, annoyed people on another level, because there's no consistency of message there. I think was the feeling, and just a little bit of trust that the decisions that we would make, we've adopted because we really want to do this and do this well, and just a little bit of trust in our judgments would be appreciated.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting because by the time we got to our final child, it makes me sound awful. So by the time we had 5 children in the house and 3 adults, and so the notion of cocooning seemed ridiculous.
Yeah.
But we were encouraged to. So by then we were in this position as a family where we were just like, we don't really care what you think, and because actually we think we can manage this.
Yeah.
And what we thought was really clear is that all care would be provided by me and my wife. It was as simple as that there would always be all these people around, but there would only be one of 2 people who would feed you, would dress you, would put you to bed, would change your nappy, all of those things. You think you can maintain we're not just handing our children into this community and going, first one to them gets to feed them. And you think that, and I think that for me, that was born out of our experience of when the very first time we adopted, where Paula, who hadn't been working, every day she was with a friend, because that's who she is. She's a social animal. And then all of a sudden that was deadened, which compounded all the other challenges. It just seemed like a sort of quite an archaic, it looks good on paper, but what does it actually do to families?
100%. And if you feel like a period of really restricted interaction, or I think the thing that certainly I found during my adoption preparation was, I was asked to essentially agree to certain things which may or may not apply to my child. And I felt like, if you tell me when I've actually adopted a boy and I know who he is, that those things will help him, and there's real belief that doing these things will help my individual child, then great. But if you want me to do things that are just sort of maybe generic good ideas that may or may not help him, then I'm going to resist that as much as I can. And I think the same sort of thing is true for cocooning. If you've got real reason to think your child needs that, then maybe that's a very different situation. But to kind of try to enforce that in a blanket way on all families and all adoptions, I think really is archaic and really does need some serious reconsideration.
Yeah, and I guess that there's a power dynamic, though, that a lot of, like you said, that there's no adoption order in place, that the children they're there on loan until that point, or there's a very strong feeling that we're not going to rock the boat. We're not going to sort of say, actually, no. I mean, some people do have that sort of self-confidence and self-assurance, but most people, in the midst of everything else that's going on, they just go, we'll just do as we're told, and we'll defer to your wisdom.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think it absolutely isn't the adopters who need to change. It's some of the practice around it needs some revisiting, I think.
The campaign starts here.
Oh, I'd love to.
Well, we'll maybe raise some conversations on Twitter, shall we? Um, so then I'm presuming then you talk about sort of those first few months. Is there a sort of the common themes you've discussed, but also is then there a common sort of sense that this improves, that people sort of emerge like butterflies from these chrysalis?
In the main, I think so. Certainly, I mean, I guess I didn't kind of clearly ask that question actually, but one of the things, and this does link back, one of the things that one of the parents said to me, which probably moved me almost anything out than anything else really. At the end, she said, it's been really good to talk about it because, no one ever asks. And I thought, well, if there was a title for an article, there it is, because that's really sad. And the point of all of this really, that there should be more chance for doctors to just talk about how they're getting on and what it feels like. And in the main, because I think for quite a few people, I hope it was a good chance to talk through some of the issues that they'd experienced. And there really was a sense for a lot of people that there'd been significant progress where it had been difficult. It was much easier for them. Their own kind of sense of well-being had been more recovered. Perhaps took longer than 6 months, but definitely most people said that they were operating far better. That certainly and obviously linked, that their children were far more settled. They got them to a school that seemed to work better for them, that the routines were established. I'd say in the vast majority of cases, there were one or two people who got really quite significant ongoing challenges that they were dealing with. But on the whole, there was a sense that between 6 months and a year, maybe, that after that point, there was a much better rhythm to what they were doing. One of the interesting things that came out is, and again, it would need so much more research, and it probably is out there, but where people had adopted siblings, that they were the people who it's taking longer for to kind of, which was an interesting thing that I hadn't anticipated, but they seem to be dealing with different layers of complexity because it was, between the children as well as with the parents.
It does feel like it's odd to think that it's probably common parlance. If you went into any adopter support group and you had this conversation, it would light a fire under the conversation, wouldn't it? It seems to be something that's really well observed, and I'm trying to think, because I don't work in adoption, so I'm not really in those conversations, but I'd be interested to know what the perception is of social workers, whether they are fully aware of the level of challenge people are facing because of this kind of inbuilt reluctance to talk. That would be a great counterpoint to do. I'm not
really, absolutely, because you can really picture that, can't you? You come away from somebody's house, they've told you they're okay, things look okay. You can't act on something if you don't know. So it does feel like, there's a lot to be done there.
Well, because I was thinking as well, because I have done some adoptive assessments, or been involved in them, and I do fostering assessments. And as an assessing social worker, you can become really it is quite a peculiar role in social work, because you develop this sort of really intimate link, not an inappropriate link, but very much people have told you things that they've told no one, and they've talked to you in a way they've never talked to anyone else, and you've spent hours talking to people, and you've unpicked stuff, and they've shared things that sometimes their partners don't even know, and you believe they can do it. You've bought into this conversation, and you think, I knew they could do it. And I wonder whether there's this really interesting sort of, I don't really want to look there, or there's a sense of sort of congratulation, of like, I knew they could do it. My recommendation was right, and together we convinced. And that sort of a fracture in that relationship, that's presuming people sort of keep the same social work, the assessing social work. But it would be interesting to find out what is really going on in social workers' heads.
Definitely. One of the things I hope to do is to, work with our local adoption with ACE and and see if they are interested in what I've been told, and if there's anything we can kind of do with that. Some of the reflections from adoptive parents about what that process is really like you say, when you're not having to be quite so careful about being assessed and scrutinized was the word that came at the most.
It is really fascinating, isn't it? Because we were sort of talking about how the world that we inhabit, like yourself, you're an academic, but the fire under this issue is your own lived experience, and that seems to be really quite, and like Dr. Laura, and lots of other people who come in, when you scratch around, you go, yeah, the fire is this lived experience. So you mentioned that you would like this to be sort of the first part of a piece of research, investigation. What would be the next follow-on pieces then?
Well, there are a couple of things. One of the parents that I interviewed is keen to, I suppose there were some things that came out of the interviews, and one of the parents is keen to work on one of them with me, which is around sibling adoptions. The people I spoke to who have had, I'm being really tentative here because I do not have a sibling adoption, so what do I know? But the people I spoke to who had adopted siblings had found it very difficult and felt quite strongly that it needed further looking at as a sort of as a whole issue, really. So I'm being like a very carefully and tentatively want to find out more about that. And then there were a couple of other things really that I have more personal knowledge of, which is, of course, the experience of being at school for an adopted child. I'm sure, I don't think I know a single adopter who has not experienced significant issues with their school experience. I think there's just, it's almost so much. I mean, but it's absolutely something that needs to be looked at. Again, this was an area that I realised I'd been very naive about, because I thought, as an ex-teacher and someone who's still in education and all those sorts of things, I thought I'll be okay with that. I know the lingo. I know, I'm quite confident in the school environment. I'm really happy to talk to the teacher, and I feel like we'll be on the same wavelength. I'm really, really happy to do my bit at home. I don't, all of those things. And I thought that would be enough. I was very, very wrong.
That's reassuring for the rest of us.
Oh gosh, what a battle. So I think, I know that's probably really sort of common, well-trodden ground really around school experiences for adopted children, but I still think there's more that needs to be looked at there. It's terrifically hard.
Yeah, it's a very deep well, isn't it, in terms of people's experience. I just going back to your original, as you were talking, I had this thought. It'd be interesting to find out people's experiences in different models of transitioning. So you've got the more current model, the University of East Anglia model, UAE model, of introductions being sort of just stretched out and a bit more gentle. And I wonder whether there's any sort of research in terms of is there an impact on adopters sort of post placement if they've gone through that transition process. I just, that's interesting. I'll get my people to talk to your people to talk to them, because that would be interesting to see if that had what impact that had on it. Sorry, but then you were saying about the different bits of research. Sorry.
Yeah, but that is interesting. Yeah, because it's phenomenally fast, isn't it? I just feel like adoption takes years, and then suddenly it's
strap in. Here we go.
Yeah.
It's like less than 10 days, isn't it? I mean, for some people,
so that would be interesting to look at. And so yes, and I'm also interested really on sort of the wider family and the kind of impact and responses from the wider family around adoption. Again, the same parent I spoke to who had. She was amazing. She had the plan around her mental health in place, but what she'd also done He's done a presentation for friends and families, a very sort of informal, nice
Yeah.
presentation to friends and families about adoption, the realities of adoption, and how they'd be parenting differently and what they could expect to see happen that might look different, and they might sort of, think was a bit soft, or all those kind of things,
Yeah.
that might, but giving all that information before you adopt. And again, they'd just done that themselves, had taken the initiative to do that, and it had really paid off for them. So I think there's something around how do wider families respond to adoption, because I mean, obviously for anybody that's a parent, the support of your friends and families is invaluable, isn't it? And I think that's all the more true when you adopt, when you need not just that kind of support, but you need people to understand, don't you, that this might look different.
Which flies in the face of cocooning.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
At that very
absolutely.
moment, when you need people the most, at moments of stress and kind of change, that's what you need. You need your friends and family, don't you?
Absolutely.
I mean, it feels like it's a really interesting sort of very grounded in lived experience pieces of research. Where can people find this? Because you said you've written an article, but is it going to be anywhere else? Is it, are you going to create a website, change the world?
Well, yes, that'd be great, wouldn't it? Well, so the article will hopefully be sent off to Adoption UK in the next few days. So, hopefully, if it looks okay to them, that should be in the magazine fairly soon. I am on LinkedIn, but
Right.
I think the thing I would love to do, because I think perhaps similarly to I think yourself, is I'm not really interested in. I'm certainly not solely interested in just producing academic articles. I would love to look into the possibility of peer-to-peer support within Coventry, really, initially at least, because I think that is invaluable. I think there is a shorthand between adopters where you just know what the other person's saying to you and how they're feeling, that you just, it's hard to get anywhere else. And I think the loss of those in-person preparation groups, I think, has just left a massive gap. People talked about the online training was fine. They had a WhatsApp group. It fairly quickly fell apart in most cases, and I think in those early days, just being able to let off a bit of steam or talk about the lovely things too that somebody else might not get, the little triumphs that sound silly, you think, to other people, but don't to another adopter, or the little moments where you were caught out because you've only actually had the child for 3 weeks, but your child is almost 3 and people expect you to know these things and you don't know those things. Those sorts of conversations that just another adopter just gets instantly, and I think it would be really fantastic to look at. I don't really know where to start, but I am keen to look at how to do that. And I think perhaps sharing hopefully some of what I found perhaps with the local adoption agencies would be a way to perhaps get into some of those things.
So we'll put your LinkedIn profile in the show notes, and if people live in Coventry, they can get in touch with you, and you'll start the group on Tuesday.
Okay, yes, that sounds like an absolute plan.
Excellent, yeah. Oh, now you're regretting everything, aren't you? Elaine, it's been absolutely wonderful to speak to you. You've given me loads and loads of your time, and it feels like a really thought-provoking conversation, asking questions that perhaps should have been asked before now, but here we are. Thank you so much for coming on, and look after yourself. And we shall direct people to the work you're doing, and we will watch this space. And as you do more research, please do get back in touch, and we'll get updates on the.
Oh, brilliant!
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, and so look after yourself, and I'll speak to you soon.
Thank you very much. That's fantastic. Thank you.